Hi everyone, my name is Tyler Wedge, and for the second video presentation for history class, I'm going to basically touch on George Washington and basically all the information and stuff that we've learned about throughout our chapters. I'm just going to go into a little bit more depth on his path in terms of how he got to where he was, in terms of the leader of the colonial army, and basically just his upbringing and a lot of his general information. So, gonna start here with George Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732, and his family ties go back to his great-grandfather, actually, John Washington, and he migrated over to America. Well, he migrated over to Virginia from England. And basically, little is known about Washington's family through then until you get to his father, Augustine Washington. And Augustine was an ambitious man who acquired land and built mills. He also grew tobacco. He then married his first wife, Jane Butler, and they had 3 children together, with George being the oldest. And the family lived on Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. They were moderately prosperous members, but they were part of Virginia's middle class. Little is known really about George Washington's childhood. I've found a few tidbits of information here. So from age 7 till 15, he was homeschooled, and he studied with the local church. By Washington's early teens, he had mastered growing tobacco, stock raising, and surveying. Now, surveying was one of his biggest accomplishments here, and when he was 16, he actually traveled with a surveying party plotting land in Virginia's Western Territory. The following year, Washington received a job as the official surveyor of the county he lived in. And basically the job, he did this for 2 or 3 years, and it really built up his character and toughened his body and mind. Now, in July 1752, Washington's brother passed, unfortunately, and then that made him the parent of the Washington lands. And he became head of Mount Vernon when he was 20 years old at the time, and throughout his life he would hold farming as one of his most honorable professions. He would also gradually increase his land holdings until there was about 8,000 acres that he'd owned altogether. And now I'm going to get to one of the most famous battles that he had, in terms of, it was one of the most difficult ones, the one he basically fought through all the adversity and found a way to get his men to safety. So before I touch on that, I'm just going to get to how he became general of the Continental Army. So before Washington had accepted the assignment to lead the army, he had been managing his family's plantation and serving in the Virginia House of Burgesses. And they were looking for a new leader at the time, and he was thrown into the mix, and he was unanimously voted in to lead the Continental Army. After accepting the position, he sat down and wrote a letter to his wife, Martha. And in this letter, he reflected on all his concerns that he had when he accepted the position at the time. He felt that it was, quotes, out of his power to refuse this appointment without exposing my character to such censures as would have reflected dishonor upon myself, end quote. So basically, if he didn't accept this position, he felt that there would be a dishonorable feeling through his character, so he wanted to accept it to go into battle for his country. Now, on July 3rd, 1775, Washington officially took command of the army. But unfortunately, the army at this point was poorly trained and undersupplied. A lot of people at this time had doubt in Washington on whether he could lead the army because he had no prior experience to leading an army at all. So they really thought that he couldn't do it. He would need more experience basically for the job. But all in all, Washington would go on to prove these people wrong. He set out to create an army shaped in large part on a British image. He also established discipline with his men in terms of lash, pillory, or also wooden horse. And in September of 1775, he emerged a plan for his army. It involved 26 regiments of infantry of 728 men, each plus one regiment of riflemen and one artilleryman. In all, that's 20,372 men became uniformly paid. This was an alright plan on paper, but Washington soon found out he could not carry it out. These men saw as their first obligation was basically to their families in farms at home, not to their actual contribution to the army, and they basically were not reluctant enough to re-enlist for other years of service coming down the line. So to gain experience for his men, he sent a few of his troops on board with an improvised navy, basically just to capture British ships and get them experience with the war in general. Now I'll move on to the war I kind of talked about earlier. It is the Battle of Long Island. So this was a war that Washington fought in, and it didn't go as planned for him, but he took steps necessary so that his troops would not be taken by the British. So the Battle of Long Island, this was 4 months before the Battle of Trenton takes place. The Continental and British armies met in the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, or what is known as the Battle of Long Island. This war was one of the largest battles of the Revolutionary War. It entailed George Washington's Continental Army, and also they were going up against British's army led by General William Howe. Now, after the British had abandoned Boston in March of 1776, their focus changed to the city of New York. And the plan for them was to isolate New York and also New England from the rest of the colonies. And so British brought over approximately 32,000 soldiers, while only the Continental Army only had 19,000 soldiers. So this war began on August 27th, 1776, when the British sent an attack on 3 fronts. So this is very important that they sent it out on 3 fronts, because 2 of these fronts were sent directly at the Americans. And these 2 fronts basically acted as a distraction, while 10,000 other British troops were sent around the outside of the colonial army. And what this did is basically flank the Americans from the east, so they had nowhere to go. The only route they had to go was back from where they came from. And this caught General Washington and his troops off guard, as you could imagine. The only plan that they had was to retreat. Now, before they retreated, Washington sent a small group of about 400 soldiers up on a hill, and this basically had a great vantage point on the British army, and they distracted the British army and they were able to fight and save the army from a complete rout. So while they were doing that, it allowed the larger group of American troops to retreat back into Brooklyn Heights. And now flipping back over to the British, this is where General William Howe went wrong. So instead of pressing in on the Americans, he ordered his men to stop their attack, and instead they dug trenches around the Continental Army because he expected the Americans to surrender at this point in the war. Another thing he also expected was for the British ships to sail around and cut off the Americans from their only line of retreat, which was across the Manhattan. But the ships never showed up because there was not enough wind to get them to where they needed to go during that time. So at this point, everything is going well for General Washington. And night falls, and Washington secretly transports 9,000 men in boats across the East River to safety. So he transported all of them across during the night. But there was still a big problem because when the sun rose the next day, there was still around 10,000 soldiers that had not crossed over yet. So these men would have likely lost their lives if they couldn't get across the river in time. But then, out of nowhere, this is kind of where the name gets itself. So the battle of it was basically the fog battle. But then, out of nowhere, a heavy fog set into the area, and the rest of the army was able to cross over the river. So after the fog finally goes away, the British were left in amazement after the whole Continental Army was gone. So basically, all of Washington's troops got out of there and fled off further back into New York at that point, and the British were left in amazement after they basically had the Americans on the ropes, and they just disappeared basically overnight and within the morning. So without a lack of wind and some heavy fog, there may have never been a United States. And so after that battle, Washington went on to keep serving the army, and until after his days were up as commander of the army, he was once called upon again to serve his country as president. So during the election in 1789, he received a vote from every elector to the Electoral College. So this is very important because he's the only president in American history to be elected by unanimous approval. So that's one of his major milestones there. So he ended up serving 2 terms and then retiring. And he headed back to his estate in Mount Vernon. He returned in the spring of 1797. Upon returning, he felt a sense of relief and accomplishment. And after that, he then devoted the rest of his time to tending to the farm's operation and management. And Washington later passed away on December 14th, 1799. So that was basically my touch on just how important Washington was to the American civilization back then. Not only was he the first officer to basically have success with the Continental Army, but he kept having that success. He won multiple wars after the Battle of Long Island. And then he later on went on to serve as our nation's first president. So he had some really big accomplishments back then, and I just wanted to go over a few of them just because we were touching on the topic in class. So again, thanks everyone for listening, and it really just goes back on just how important he was to us during the war, and how important he was to us for just starting up the United States in general. So thanks a lot for everyone watching.